Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Buckeye Politics. It's me, your favorite Ohioan. Today, we are doing the official, final governor prediction for the 2022 midterm elections. It's been a long time in the making. Can't believe we're only 2 days away. Before we get into the video, though, I do want to remind everyone that I will be going live with a couple of friends on November 8th, beginning at 6:30 p.m. to watch the midterm elections live. Hope you can all tune into the stream. Going to be a lot of fun, and we're going to be going as long as it takes to see the results come in. So if you have nothing else going on that evening, I do encourage you to watch my coverage of it. So now we're going to get into my predictions for the governor's races. We're going to start by filling in the safe states for both the Republicans and Democrats. These are the states that will vote for each respective party by more than 10 percentage points. So we're going to start by filling in the safe Republican states. These are the states that are going to vote for the Republican Party by more than 10 percentage points, as I just said. They include the states of Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota. Kristi Noem, there's been a couple of polls that show she might be in a little bit of trouble, but there's also been plenty of polls that have her up big. She's well liked among the Republican base. I think she's going to win handily. Nebraska, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina, the state of Texas, Iowa, Ohio, the state of Florida, Vermont, and New Hampshire, two more liberal-leaning states. Really not a whole lot to say about these states. I'll talk about my reasoning for some of the more questionable ones. The state of Texas, Greg Abbott has maintained just above a 10-point lead in the polls. I think he'll probably win by just about 10 points or so. I don't think he's going to run away with it, but I do think he'll beat Beto O'Rourke by more than 10 points, probably about a 12-point victory. The state of Florida, this is a state that I long had as likely Republican. I figured DeSantis would win, but I thought him winning by more than 10 or winning by double digits was a little bit out there. But recently, he has just absolutely blown away the polls, and he's been leading Charlie Crist by 10, 11, 12 points. And we've seen turnout for the Republican Party in Miami-Dade County, and just across the state, there is nothing good for Democrats. I mean, Republicans are beating the Democrats in Miami-Dade County. Registered Republicans are turning out heavily. The polls show Republicans just absolutely trouncing the Democrats, and so because of that, I moved the election to safe Republican. Instead of Iowa, Kim Reynolds has been leading in pretty much every single poll. She's the incumbent governor. She's well liked. Iowa's been treading to the Republican Party by quite a bit. I think she's going to win very handily. My home state of Ohio, Mike DeWine has polled very well. He's leading Nan Whaley by like 18, 19 points, and he's going to win a re-election handily. I mean, he's beloved by the more moderate suburban Republicans, and the more Trumpian base is going to turn out for him anyway, just because his opponent, Nan Whaley, the Democrat, is just so far left. So DeWine's going to unite the more moderate suburbanites as well as the more Trumpian rural base and absolutely trounce Nan Whaley. Vermont, New Hampshire, if you have not followed politics, you're probably confused why I put two pretty liberal-leaning states as safe Republican. That is because Vermont has a Republican incumbent named Phil Scott. He is a very liberal Republican, part of that northeastern Rockefeller Republican. He's been in office for a couple of terms. He always wins re-election easily. He's going to win re-election. Similar story in New Hampshire. Chris Sununu is a very popular governor. He's also going to win by 10 points. He's leading the polls very handily. We are now going to fill in the safe Democratic states, of which there are actually only a couple. They are the states of California, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, and I believe that is it. Only 4 safe Democratic states. So now as we fill in the more competitive states, the likely and lean and tilt states, the Republicans have a huge advantage. I mean, Republicans have 23 seats that are going to be safe for them. No matter what you do, the Republican Party will control 23 governorships. The Democrats only have 10. Pretty big sign. We're going to start. Do we go east to west, or do we do it by margin? Let's go east to west. We're going to start instead of Maine. So the state of Maine, incumbent Democrat Janet Mills, as you can see here on Real Clear Politics, has maintained a pretty sizable lead. She's led by 6, 10, 12, 14, 11, and she's up against Paul LePage, who is the Republican nominee. He is the former governor of Maine. He served 2 terms. He retired in 2018. Janet Mills won, and now he's trying to run for re-election again against her. And Paul LePage, this is a race that I originally thought the Republican Party would be able to pretty easily pick up. Paul LePage was not the most liked governor, but he was not disliked. And Maine is a state that is trended towards the Republican Party. I mean, Trump did very well in northern Maine. Even despite the national environment, northern Maine still trended towards him slightly, and he won a lot of these counties here in the more rural northern part of Maine. And Paul LePage has a history of doing pretty well in the more liberal-leaning parts. So I always thought Paul LePage had a shot at winning. The polls, however, show Janet Mills leading very handily. I mean, there's only a couple polls that even have it within single digits. Because of that, I do believe Paul LePage outperforms the polls as he always does. He is probably the best candidate Republicans could put up. There's been a lot of work on the ground for him, and he's been working his butt off. But I think Maine is just too liberal a state. And Paul LePage, he never won he never got more than 50% of the vote when he was governor. He always won because there was a bunch of candidates running, and he would always get like 44, 45. He would always get like 40. He would always be in the mid 40s in terms of the percentage of the vote he got. So he never got more than 50%. And Janet Mills is trouncing him in the polls. However, I do think it's going to only be a lean margin because he does have a history of outperforming the polls. We're now going to the state of Rhode Island. There's really not a whole lot to say here. I don't even think it's listed as one of the more competitive states. No, it's not. The state of Rhode Island is really probably not going to be all that competitive, but I believe it's going to be under 10. Incumbent Democrat Dan McKee is despised in the state. He's, I believe, the most unpopular governor in the entire country. He only won his primary with like 35% of the vote. Republican nominee Ashley Callis has run a good campaign, but she just hasn't gotten the funding. And Rhode Island is a pretty Democratic-leaning state, and the polls also don't show this race being very competitive. So while I do think it's closer than expected, I don't think that Dan McKee is going to trounce Ashley Callis like some people think. I do think it's going to be a pretty sizable win for Dan McKee. The state of Connecticut is also going to be likely Democratic. This is a race that I personally thought Republicans had a good chance in. It's not even listed as a competitive race anymore. But long story short, the incumbent Democrat Ned Lamont, back in 2018, he took on Republican Bob Stefanowski, and he only won by 4 points. So Connecticut is a very liberal state, but their Democrat only won by 4 points, and that was in a blue wave year. And then in a red wave year, Ned Lamont is up for re-election against his same opponent, Bob Stefanowski, back again. And so for a long time, I thought, well, if the Democrats only won by 4 points and in a blue wave year, and they're taking it's the same matchup, and it's going to be a red wave here, Republicans should be in a pretty good spot. No, well, unfortunately not. Bob Stefanowski has not ran a very good campaign. Ned Lamont has also become very popular during his term as governor. He's won over a lot of more swing voters and united the Democrats against him. And Bob Stefanowski has ran a pretty abysmal campaign, all things considered. I think this is definitely a seat that we probably could have won, but Bob Stefanowski threw it away by going woke and a lot of social issues, alienating the base, and it just proves that you can't win by caving in on all the issues. So likely Democrat. The state of New York, this is a race that is very interesting. I'm going to go look at the polls for this race. New York. As you can see here, Kathy Hochul has maintained a slim lead, but a 6-point lead in the aggregate over Lee Zeldin. But that is a huge increase from when she led by 10 and almost 15-20 back in September and October. Hochul leads by about 6 points statewide. She's began to surge a little bit. I don't think that this race is going to flip to the Republicans. There's just too much ground to make up. I must see New York City, Brooklyn, 500,000 votes. Manhattan, 500,000 votes. Bronx, 300,000 votes. Queens, 300,000 votes. There's just over 1 million votes that Lee Zeldin has to make up for. And while I believe it's possible that he just gets crazy turnout on Long Island and Staten Island, the more Republican parts of the state, and does very well in upstate New York, I just don't think the votes are there, unfortunately. The polls have shown this race more competitive than expected, but I just don't see how Lee Zeldin can win. This would be a crazy upset. So while I do think I think it's going to be under double digits, and I think that's going to be closer than everyone expects, I'm going to put it as lean for Kathy Hochul. I believe she will win by about 4 to 5 points. I just don't see it, unfortunately. I mean, Lee Zeldin would have to just run up the margins. He would have to do everything right. And is it possible he wins? Absolutely. I believe that there is certainly a chance that Lee Zeldin pulls off the victory. But right now, I just don't see it. The polls clearly show Hochul leading, and while Zeldin's tight in the margin, I just don't think it's going to be enough. All I can say is hopefully Zeldin's campaign is good enough that it propels some more Republicans in the state legislature. Then they maybe force Hochul to do something about the crime issue. Really, all I can say, maybe we take back a chamber in the New York State Legislature, and maybe we force Hochul to actually do something about the crime issue. That's probably the best case scenario as of now. Like I said, it's possible Zeldin wins, but there is just such a hill to climb over. This is not going to be. It would not be an easy victory for any stretch of the imagination, and I just don't see it. We've only seen one poll. We've only really had 2 or 3 polls that have the race that even have Zeldin up or have the race tied. The rest show Hochul leading, but by very slim margins. So, like I said, I do think it's possible Zeldin wins. I don't think it's the most likely scenario. I think New York's just too blue. I'm going to keep it as lean Democrat. Instead of Pennsylvania, this is a state that I long thought Republicans had a good chance of picking up. Republican nominee Doug Mastriano is a little bit more far right than I think most people would prefer. However, he started off the election polling very close to Josh Shapiro, who was for a long time, I mean, Pennsylvania is pretty much a blue state where polls almost always overestimate Democrats. However, the polls very early on showed this race as a dead heat, with Shapiro at a very narrow lead and nowhere close to 50%, despite Josh Shapiro being pretty much a household name as he's he's the state's attorney general. He'd won statewide a couple of times, and Mastriano was just some state senator. So Josh Shapiro should have a bunch of name recognition. He was getting a bunch of funding, and even then, he was only leading Mastriano by about 4 or 5 points or so. However, we've seen, unfortunately, the Republican Party just leave Doug Mastriano out to dry. He's gotten very little funding from the Republican Governors Association. He's gotten no funding from the Republican Party as a whole. I think the most he's got is a rally with Ron DeSantis, and actually Trump has been his largest funder. I think most of Doug Mastriano's campaign funds have came from Donald Trump. And unfortunately, that's not going to be enough to win. When Josh Shapiro is getting $60 million from the DNC to paint Doug Mastriano as this far-right, unelectable, neo-Confederate, far-right candidate, and you can't even respond to that, you can't even get a single ad out there, and even if you campaign across the state, meet with voters, it's not going to bode well for you. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen. Josh Shapiro has really surged in the polls, and he currently leads by about 10 points in terms of the aggregate. I don't think he's going to win by that much. I do think there's a silent Doug Mastriano vote out there like there was for Trump. I mean, Pennsylvania is a state that only voted for Joe Biden by about a point. It's a very competitive state, and Republicans have room to grow in some of the more rural, white working class parts of the state. I think Doug Mastriano does very well in western Pennsylvania, where polls do have a history of underestimating the GOP. But however, I think Josh Shapiro just smokes him in the Philly suburbs, which is, like I said, a very populated part of the state. So I think that the race is going to be closer than the 10 points the 10-point lead Josh Shapiro has. I just don't see how Mastriano can win at this point. I'm going to put it as lean Democrat. I do believe there is a silent Mastriano vote out there. You know, if everything you hear about him on TV is how he's this far-right, neo-Confederate, then you're probably not going to say in a poll where you have to give out all your personal information, yeah, I support this guy. But a 10-point margin is a huge margin to make up. And honestly, Doug Mastriano got screwed over by the Republican Party. If the GOP actually gave him money to get his message on the air and really funded his campaign, I believe he probably would have won this race relatively handily. Josh Shapiro is a pretty poor candidate. He only won by a couple of points statewide before, and he's clearly not that well liked. I mean, he's barely polling at 50%, despite him basically portraying his opponent as a neo-Nazi. So clearly he's not a very good candidate, but unfortunately he's controlling the narrative, he's controlling the airwaves, and Doug Mastriano, well, I think he's a good guy. I really hope he pulls off the upset. I just don't see it. We're going to go over to the state of Michigan. This is a state that I've gone back and forth on for a long time. It's a state that has always had a very big Democratic lean. I thought Tudor Dixon might be able to pull it off, and she certainly tightened the margin, but it's such a hard choice. Signal, which has the largest likely voter sample, has Whitmer only up by 3, and that's a good sign in my opinion. Emerson having Whitmer up by 5 is also a decent sign for Tudor Dixon. These are polls that are usually a little bit more accurate, but do have a slight Democratic bias. I have no idea how this race is going to go. Whitmer has ran a pretty bad campaign, all things considered. Tudor Dixon has pretty much united the Republican Party against her, but Whitmer has also, she has a base as well. And while Dixon has certainly tightened this lead, and she appears to have the momentum, I don't really see it right now. I do think Gretchen Whitmer ekes out a very narrow victory. I'm going to put this as tilt Democratic. I think that this is a race that's going to be up in the air. I think we're not going to know probably for a while. I think Tudor Dixon can easily win this race. Don't get me wrong. She's from the Grand Rapids area, which is an area she has to do well in. Grand Rapids is an area that is usually a very Republican-leaning area, but you can see here it shifted to the left quite a bit. And while Tudor Dixon also has appeal to the more Trumpian base, she held a rally in Macomb County, which is a very white working-class, unionized county that is very pro-Trump. That is a county that she's probably going to do well in. However, Whitmer, just in Detroit and the suburbs, has ran a decent campaign focusing on abortion. It's disgusting that she has to run on that, but it is an issue that will turn out the Democratic base. And because of that, I do think that Whitmer narrowly pulls off a win. I think Tudor Dixon has done everything she can, and I think this race is going to be very close, but I do have to give the edge to Gretchen Whitmer, unfortunately. I think Michigan's just too blue, and Whitmer's has too high name recognition, and the polls clearly show her up by decent margin. She's not going to win by like 2 or 3 points. I think this is going to be a race decided by less than a point. I think Tudor Dixon can easily pull off a win here, but if I had to make a decision, I do give the edge to Gretchen Whitmer. We're now going to go to the state of Wisconsin. This is a state that's going to end up going to the GOP. And both the governor and Senate elections. I mean, polls in Wisconsin always overestimate Democrats by huge margins, and you already have Tim Michels, the Republican nominee, leading, and Tony Evers is really not that popular. Going to be lean Republican. I think Tim Michels is going to win by about 2 to 3 points, probably similar to a Youngkin margin, maybe a little bit, maybe do a little bit better. Ron Johnson is going to absolutely trounce Mandela Barnes, but I think the governor race will be a little bit more competitive because Tony Evers does have some of that rural, moderate voter appeal. Not that much, but enough that it's going to be a closer race than expected. And Tim Michels has ran a very good campaign. I mean, he's leading in the polls by a couple of points here and there. It's going to be closer than people expect, but even some of the polls like this one from Marquette, this is a poll that almost always overestimates the Democratic Party. They have it as a tie. Data for Progress, this is another poll that is a Democrat internal. They have Tim Michels leading. Trafalgar is technically a Republican internal, but they are the gold standard for polling, especially in the Rust Belt. They have Tim Michels up by 2. The Hill / Emerson, this is a pollster that, also is a decent pollster. They have Michels up by 1. So if you count polling mistakes as well as the history of all these pollsters, I do believe Tim Michels is going to eke out about a 2-point win or so. State of Illinois, this is a state that is really not a whole lot to say. The polls in this race have been more competitive than expected. I mean, Darren Bailey, the Republican nominee, he's a pretty pro-Trump guy. He was in the state legislature. He's a very Trumpian candidate, but he has made this race pretty competitive for whatever reason. J.B. Pritzker, the incumbent Democrat, is really not all that popular, but it is Illinois. It is such a safe Democratic state. I think it's going to be under 10, like the polls suggest, but I don't think Darren Bailey is going to win it. I almost forgot to film the state of Georgia. Brian Kemp, the Republican nominee, not a whole lot to say here, is going to be likely a Republican. I think Kemp wins by about 5 to 6 points or so. Stacey Abrams has collapsed in the polling. She's not liked in the state. Kemp has done a good job at appealing to those more moderate Republicans who voted for Joe Biden in 2020, but may still lean Republican or may lean conservative on certain issues. When it comes to crime, inflation, these are voters that they're more moderate suburbanites who are lean right on certain issues, but may left on others. And they're in the Georgia suburbs. They're mostly young, new transplants. Brian Kemp has done a very good job appealing to those voters. He has also done a good job at winning back the Trumpian base, who didn't really like him, honestly, for a while because of the election stuff. But Kemp has maintained a pretty sizable lead in the polls. Stacey Abrams is just a horrible candidate, and I do believe Kemp's going to win this race by a pretty big margin, by probably about 6 points. State of Minnesota, that's going to be lean Democrat. A couple polls have shown this race close. I don't really think it's going to be that close. I think the Republicans have a pretty poor nominee in Scott Jensen. He's not the worst nominee we could have put up, but he's certainly not good. Tim Walz, the incumbent Democrat, has maintained a pretty sizable lead in the polls, and he appears to be surging a little bit. And while I think Jensen does better than expected, I don't think he's going to lose by 4. I think he probably loses by about 2 to 3 points. A respectable showing. Instead of Kansas, this is a race that should be an easy win for the GOP. Kansas voted for Donald Trump by 14, 15 points. It's been a solidly Republican state for a very long time. However, the Democrat incumbent Laura Kelly, who won back in 2018 in a blue wave year by a couple of points because the Republican vote was split, there was a third-party candidate who was running as a conservative but an independent, and he split the Republican vote and allowed Laura Kelly to get in the office. Since then, she's been a pretty moderate Democrat on certain issues, or she's maintained that view of her persona has been as a moderate Democrat. The Republicans put up Derek Schmidt, who is a pretty solid nominee. He is the Kansas Attorney General, and we have gotten no polling for this race, so it's very hard to make a decision. The polls that we do have Laura Kelly leading by a couple of points, although Schmidt is clearly within the margin of error. This is a race that's going to be very close, but I do in the end give the victory to Derek Schmidt by about a tilt margin. I think the polls are probably overestimating suburban voters just because that's a much easier demographic to poll, and that's also going to be Laura Kelly's strong suit. Laura Kelly is going to do very well with suburbanites near Kansas City and near the Missouri border, while Derek Schmidt is going to absolutely trounce her in the rural areas. Rural Kansas is a state that's been really weird politically. It's always been kind of hard to poll. And back in 2020, a lot of people said the Senate race might go Democrat or be very close because the poll showed the race being very competitive. But the Republicans ended up winning pretty handily back in 2020 for both the president race and the Senate race in the state. I think we may see a similar story, although Laura Kelly does have a decent amount of moderate appeal. But in the end, I do give a very narrow edge to Derek Schmidt. And this does put the Republican Party at 26 governorship seats. making them continue to control the governor association, which doesn't really mean a whole lot, just kind of interesting because they will have a majority of governorships no matter how the rest of these states shake out. And as you'll see, they will actually expand their majority. We're now going to go to the state of Colorado. Not a whole lot to say here. Jared Polis, the incumbent Democrat, is very well liked. He's a little bit more of a moderate Democrat on certain issues. He's beloved in the state. He's perfect fit. The people there like him. He's been polling pretty well against Heidi Ganahl, the Republican nominee. She's ran a decent campaign, but Jared Polis is he's a pretty popular governor in the state, and there's been really no polls that show this race all that competitive. I'm going to put it as likely Democrat. State of New Mexico. This is a race that I really thought Republicans had a shot in. Mark Ronchetti ran for Senate back in 2020. He made the race much more competitive than it probably should have been. Polls had him losing by about 10 points. He only lost by about 5. He is a weatherman for the Albuquerque area. Everyone in the state knows him. Michelle Lujan Grisham is very scandal-plagued. She's not very well liked, but for whatever reason, the polls do show her with a pretty narrow lead. I think Ronchetti has done a pretty poor job at attacking her on certain issues. For example, Michelle Lujan Grisham, just to show you how bad of a candidate Michelle Lujan Grisham is, she sexually assaulted one of her male staffers. It was all in court. She was basically convicted of it. Well, she had to pay him or something. But Mark Ronchetti really hasn't campaigned on that. Unfortunately, he did decently in the debates, but we're nothing really that outstanding. Michelle Lujan Grisham has maintained a pretty decent approval rating. Considering that, I mean, she's not liked in the state, but considering what she's done and her corruption scandals and stuff, she has maintained a decent approval rating. This is a race that I really think Ronchetti could have won. I do give a narrow edge to Michelle Lujan Grisham, though. I'm putting it as still Democrat. Trafalgar is the only poll that has Ronchetti leading. They have him up by 1. The Hill and Emerson have Michelle Grisham up by 2. So when you balance that out, it's probably a very slim lead for Michelle Lujan Grisham. I certainly think Mark Ronchetti can pull out this race at the end of the day. I just don't think it's the most likely scenario because, like I said, despite her scandals, Mark Ronchetti has not done a very good job at attacking her for them. Because, a candidate can be full of scandals, but if you don't attack them on that, if you don't really run a campaign and get those scandals out to voters, and you're going to have a hard time winning. So I think Mark Ronchetti is going to make this race very close. I give a slight edge to Michelle Lujan Grisham. State of Arizona. This is a state that I have always had it going to the Republican Party very narrowly, and I continue to believe that. I think Kari Lake's going to win pretty handily. Basically, she's destroying Katie Hobbs in all the polls. Only one poll recently has even had Katie Hobbs leading. That's by Marist, which has a history of being a pretty Democratic-leaning pollster. Emerson, which is a great poll for Arizona, has Kari Lake up by 3. OH Predictive Insights, which is a poll that always overestimates Democrats, has Kari Lake leading by 2. New York Times always has a huge Democratic bias as the race tied. Fox 10, a local Arizona pollster, is Lake up by 11. Daily Trafalgar is Lake up by 3. Data for Progress, a Democrat internal, is Lake up by 4. And there's a few polls that have Katie Hobbs up by 1, but still, those are outliers. They have a large margin of error, and they're done by a pollster based out of Pennsylvania, which I don't think has ever polled Arizona before, and a local Arizona station, which is basically either a hit or miss. Kari Lake is leading pretty handily, as you can see here, in terms of the average, leading by about 2 points or so. I think she does a little bit better than that. I think this Lake plus 3 to 4 is probably the most likely scenario. Katie Hobbs has ran a horrible campaign. She refused to debate Kari Lake. She gets destroyed on it whenever she goes on CNN and MSNBC. Kari Lake is in a perfect campaign. Kari Lake has been attacked every way imaginable by the Democrats, by the media, she is just, it bounces right off her. She is a comeback for everything. She is very well liked and very well known in Maricopa County in the Phoenix area, which is an area she has to do well in. I mean, that's the reason that Trump lost Arizona. Phoenix, Maricopa County took a 5-point shift to the left. This is a county that usually votes solidly Republican, but unfortunately, Trump was not very well liked there, and it swung 5 points to the left. Biden narrowly won the county, and he narrowly won the state. And Kari Lake is from Phoenix. She was on the news in Phoenix. Polls show her doing very well. The voters from the Maricopa County and the Phoenix area, and I do think Kari Lake wins the state of Arizona pretty handily. I don't think she's gonna absolutely destroy Katie Hobbs, but the 11-point lead I've seen her have. I don't think she's gonna win by 11 points or whatever, but I do think she's gonna win by about 3 to 4. Another thing that I want to note is Hispanic voters in places like Pima County and Santa Cruz County. Santa Cruz County, a very Hispanic county, shifted 12 points to the right. Graham County and Greenlee County, 2 more Hispanic counties, shifted 9 and 6 points to the right. Yuma County, a very Hispanic county, shifted 5 points to the right. I think Kari Lake is going to do very well in these counties, in the more Hispanic counties, as well as doing better in in Maricopa County with more white suburbanites. And I think Kari Lake's going to win this race pretty handily. And I think she's probably going to be one of the best governors in the entire country. State of Nevada, that's also going to lean to the Republican Party. Joe Lombardo is a sheriff from not Maricopa County, excuse me, Clark County, home to Las Vegas. Clark County is the largest county in Las Vegas, in Nevada, population-wise, home to Las Vegas. He's been the sheriff there for a long time, and he's won re-election there a couple times. He's a very well-known guy. He's a little bit more of a more moderate Republican, which allows him to appeal to those suburbanites that may be trending away, but also to do very well with the more Trumpian base in the rural parts of the state. He's been polling very well. He's been leading in the aggregate by about 2 to 3 points or so. I think he wins by about that margin. Looking at Nevada, it's a state that is trending towards the right. Clark County, which is home to Las Vegas, shifted about 1.5 towards the Republicans. Pretty much the entire rural part of the state shifted a few points towards Trump. And even some of the suburbs like Carson City and Washoe County, this is home to like the Reno area. They shifted a little bit to the left, but I think that Joe Lombardo is going to do a good job counteracting that because he is running a good campaign based on crime, inflation, and he is a little bit more of a moderate, soft-spoken Republican compared to Trump. So I think he does very well in the Reno area, while also doing very well in Las Vegas because he's from there. He's won re-election there several times. I think he's the perfect nominee, and I think he's going to win by 3 to 4 points or so, very similar to his neighbor to the south, Kari Lake. Oregon, state that I've gone back and forth on. This is a state that should be safe Democrat in all honesty. Let's see the margin. Biden won the state of Oregon by 16 points. He got 56% of the vote. Trump got 40%. That's mostly thanks to Portland, which Biden got 70% of the vote in, which gave him about 300,000 votes. The rest of the state is more rural, and it voted for Trump, but only by a couple thousand votes here and there. So Portland is basically where Portland goes, the state goes. And the vote in Oregon has been split by several candidates, or by 2 candidates really, because we have the Republican nominee and the Democratic nominee, obviously, but we also have a third-party candidate named Betsy Johnson. Betsy Johnson is a state senator. She is a little bit more of she's very weird politically. She's very far left on certain issues, but she's pretty moderate and even conservative leaning on other issues. A very strange candidate politically, but she's running as an independent, and she appears to be splitting the vote. Initially, it appeared she was taking a lot of the vote away from Tina Kotek, who is the Democratic nominee, who is very unpopular in the state. But recently, because of some of her statements on things like logging and crime, some people are saying that Betsy Johnson may actually be taking votes away from Christine Drazan, the Republican nominee. I've seen mixed results on that. I really don't know who Betsy Johnson is taking more votes away from, Christine Drazan or Tina Kotek. All I know is Tina Kotek is despised in the state. She's basically the protege of Kate Brown, who is the incumbent Democrat. She's term limited, so she cannot run for re-election. But Tina Kotek is the state Senate Majority Leader. She's basically the protege of Kate Brown, who, like I said, is very unpopular. And Christine Drazan has done a good job at campaigning on that, saying, look, Tina Kotek is literally going to be Kate Brown 2.0, when Kate Brown is one of the most unpopular governors in the country. And with the vote being split, I do think Christine Drazan probably narrowly pulls off a victory. I could easily see Tina Kotek win this race. There was a poll that just came out that has her up by 5, but that Betsy Johnson only gets 9% of the vote, and that appears to be an outlier compared to the rest of these polls. A lot of these polls seem to have Johnson polling at about in the mid-teens. This poll only has Johnson at 9, so there might be a polling miss there, and also it has a slightly less likely voters than some of these other polls. If you take into the polls that tend to be a little bit more accurate in Oregon, have a larger sample size, then they pretty much show Drazan with a very narrow lead. I would not be surprised at all if Tina Kotek pulls off a win, but I do give a slight edge to Christine Drazan, just because the vote's being split, and Oregon is clear. There's clearly something brewing there for a Republican to win. I'm going to the state of Alaska now. This is a state that's going to be very interesting because well, it just is. There have really been very little polls for this election. Incumbent Republican Dunleavy, he's done a decent job. Mike Dunleavy, he's done a decent job, I guess. He's really not all that well known. Some of the polls show this race a little bit more competitive than others. Some show it as a pretty easy win for him. Some show it more competitive. There is ranked choice voting, so like we saw for the House race with Sarah Palin and Mary Pelota. Like, it's just, Alaska's such a cursed state politically now because of ranked choice voting. Even if an election seems to be safe for the Republicans or the Democrats, no matter even if someone's leading in the polls, if because of ranked choice voting, that pretty much leaves it up in the air. So I'm going to put this race as likely Republican. I think the Republican, Mike Dunleavy, is going to win in the end. I just think the margin just is iffy. We don't really know that. So with that, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. And if you did, please like and subscribe for more. Also, don't forget to vote. Remember to vote. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow for the Senate prediction and on Tuesday for the election night stream.